your brain has got to be organized so that it's capable of understanding the things that are most constant about the environment, right? And you might think, well, the things that are the most constant are the most real. That's a way of defining real. It lasts a long time and it's evident everywhere. Okay, so then you might think, well, what are the most real things that human beings have to deal with? You know, and one answer to that is, well, there are certain kinds of objective realities that are the most real. So you might say, well, things like trees are extraordinarily real. But one of the things I'd like to point out to you is that despite the fact that trees are quite real, they're not as real as dominance hierarchies. Because dominance hierarchies were around for a couple of 100 million years before there were trees. And so there have been dominance hierarchies around for 400 million years, long before there were vertebrates of our type. And so the dominance hierarchy is an extraordinarily constant feature of life. And part of the reason that we're wired up to be able to detect variations in dominance hierarchy status is because the fact of that structure is constant across all times and all places. And so it's built right into our nervous systems. And the fact that we share the ability to assess our dominance hierarchy position with crustaceans, and which have a very simple nervous system, and the fact that the same pharmacological substances work on crustaceans that work on us for the same reasons, at least with regards to dominance hierarchy, indicates that the dominance hierarchy counter that you have functioning at the very base of your brain, so to speak, is an unbelievably potent mechanism, and you're using it all the time. One example is, you know, you might ask yourself why people are so obsessed with fashion, and why fashions have to change every year. And part of the reason for that is that by attending to fashion and keeping up, or being even on the avant-garde, you show that you're ahead of the curve. And the curve is always changing, right? It's like a technological curve. You have to stay ahead of the... It isn't so much that you master the technology, it's that you stay ahead of the technology and master the new. And that indicates that you're conscious and alive and aware and capable of competing, and that's one of the things that makes you more attractive, at least in principle, as a mate, or at least more competitive with the other creatures with whom you're competing for the attention of potential mates. So that's just another indication of exactly how possessed you are by the operation of these deep-seated biological systems. And we know, for example, that there's very, very little difference between a severe clinical depression and a very severe dominance defeat. It's the same biological process, fundamentally. What happens often with people who are clinically depressed is that their self-assessed dominance is much lower than their actual competence. And it's actually the gap between their competence and their self-worth assessment that constitutes the pathology. So, you know, so you have someone, when I assess people for depression, I say, well, look, you know, do you have a job? Is it a good job? You know, do you have a family? Do you have an intimate partner? Do you have interests in various things in your life, you know, outside of your work? You know, do you have the sort of education that you want? How's your physical health? Do you have a drug and alcohol problem? And if the answer to all those is the proper answer, and they still feel really terrible, then you might think, oh, well, that person's suffering from clinical depression because their self-assessed dominant status is not in keeping with their actual social status. You know, as opposed to people who come in and you ask them the same questions and it's like, their family's completely insane, they're alienated from them. You know, they had a brain injury when they were 4 because their father hit them against a wall. They've got no education at all. They've got an alcohol problem. You know, they've been unemployed for 7 years and they have a personality disorder. It's like, well, they feel terrible, but they're not depressed. They just have terrible lives. You know, and it's not like you're not going to suffer if you have a terrible life. But if I give someone like that an antidepressant or suggest that they take one, you know, it might stop them from cutting their wrists, but the probability that it's really going to improve their situation is relatively low because, like, what the hell are you going to do with that? It's just too overwhelming a problem to even address. All right, so it looks like the dominance hierarchy as such seems to be represented by masculine symbols. And it's something to keep in mind when you watch movies, because symbols, especially that are associated with the father, like the king, for example, are representations of the dominant structure. So perhaps you can accept for a minute the association between the dominance hierarchy and culture. You see how those are the same thing, or at least that they're similar. Our culture is actually made up of a variety of overlapping dominance hierarchies, right? Because different professions and different specialties have their own dominance hierarchies, and they're sort of integrated into a meta hierarchy. But regardless, the culture is a dominance hierarchy, a complex dominance hierarchy. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what exactly makes up the culture? What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about the culture and the dominance hierarchy? And so that leads into questions like, what exactly constitutes a law? You know, so we have laws, and you might think, well, what does it mean that there's a law? Well, we can look at the obvious things. There's a rule of some sort that's been written down. That's one. There's a rule that's been written down that if you transgress against, you'll be tracked down and punished. That's another example of a law. Another example is, well, it's a custom, right? Most of the things that we have as laws are customs that people have adopted, at least in principle, to regulate our interactions so that the probability of mutual cooperation is high and the probability of mutual aggression is low. And so you might say, well, why do we all go forward on a green light? That's arbitrary. Why is that a law? And the answer is, well, because everybody decided that that would be a law, and then they decided they would act it out. So it's a custom, and you can see why it's an extraordinarily useful custom, because if we didn't have it, then we'd be crashing into each other at every intersection, and none of our vehicles would be good for anything. So that's another example of a law. So if you think about a law as a set of customs, then you start to see the law as the codified version of a behavioral contract, right? There's ways that we have all agreed to act, or even if we haven't agreed to act that way, we've agreed that there should be a structure that describes how you should act. And that's what the culture is, you know, unless you're a nihilist or an anarchist or a criminal or a terrorist or something like that, you basically accept the fact that this structure has to exist, and then you try to position yourself within it. Okay, so then you can think, well, the culture and the dominance hierarchy is two things at the same time, or maybe even three things. One is, it's the way you act. So when you say that you're a citizen of a given country, what that essentially means is that you imitate the body of laws that that country has erected. You're a behavioral manifestation of those rules, roughly speaking. Or reverse, you could say, the law is a codified representation of the way everybody in the culture is behaving. There's like a dyadic interaction, right? And so the law and the culture is actually a pattern of behaviors and expectations around those behaviors that everyone shares. And you could also say it's the cumulative knowledge that the culture shares. So the culture as a whole has a body of knowledge, some of which is objective and some of which is moral and behavioral. And you, as a fragment of that, also have that, at least in fragmentary form. Right? You're a partial representation of the entire culture. That would be something similar to Freud's idea of the superego. Right? Because for Freud, there was an id and an ego and a superego. And the id was basically, you know, biology and its ability to control you. And the ego was poor little you. And the superego was the terrible force of culture crushing the little ego between the terrible force of biology and itself. And so the superego, in some sense, is culture.